you're going to have to bring the separation between the level of the master that has um, a mediated relationship to things and therefore can stay theoretical and worry, and that's going to come later, do things like worry about their salvation and worry about the good life, whereas the servant has a practical relationship to things and is therefore, so to speak, the motor of development of culture. And there you don't have worries of salvation and the good life, but you have a concern with things working, right? With functionality, with effectiveness, with the practical exigencies of culture. So here we already see, we already see these two common phenomena in human culture emerging, stemming from the relationship to the things that each one of these forms of consciousness has. So however you want to fill out those historical details is kind of up to you. I think any historical example, as long as you keep it vague enough, will be fine.
How about top dog and peon?
What's the first one?
How about top dog and peon?
Well, yeah, it gets to the same point. But what's important is that of course well, we'll get to it, that the master is the one who risked death, and the slave or the servant or the bondsman or the peon is the one who didn't risk death. And in that reveals their proximity to the things. They're not the bondsman is not pure for itself. It still has this residual reification going on. That and therefore it's so to speak fated to deal with things and make them nice for the master.
Yeah. So right now in the Chinese virus we're dealing with, right, we have the slaves, the people who are driving trucks, stocking grocery stores, sterilizing products, and then we have the masters, right, the kind of the literati who are waiting by stuff. But in this case, the ones who are close to death are actually the slaves are close to death.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but that's kind of a historical. That is kind of an historical accident, but yeah.
It's not clear to me as we go into this. Maybe it will be clear. I don't have good commentaries on this, but you can clarify it. So there are several ways we can take this master-slave dichotomy. It's not clear which senses we should use in considering that. And one sense, for example, is that it is a personification. And when we say master-slave, we're talking about personification, master of a whole class of individuals who have that characteristic, and same with slave. And another is that this is another possibility. It's a state of nature argument, like you get with, say, Rousseau, where you're saying, let's strip away all culture and let's consider in its barest content the interaction of one human to another human being in a non-cultural specific way. Another possibility is that it's hyperbole, that we all have tendencies, in some cases to be a master, in some cases to be a slave. And this just sets out as an extreme these tendencies, not to say that any individual is a master, any individual is a slave. It's to say that we have certain tendencies which we adhere to. So in fact, we are in our exchanges with other people, sometimes masters, sometimes slaves. So there are a whole range of possibilities for considering this dichotomy, and it's not clear to me yet, maybe it will be, in what sense he intends this.
Yeah, there's this interesting transition in here. Maybe we'll get to the text here in a minute, between animal desire and human desire. So that actually the master slave in it is intrinsic to human desire. It's inescapable. I mean, there's a statement in there about, or it's either in Kojève or Hegel, I forget now, but about like the, yeah, about what it is to be, I think that's that, oh, damn it, I don't know which one it's in, but
It's
I guess we'll look at the text here. Okay, Kojève, okay, yeah. Shall we start into the text here? Michael, where do you want to, shall we begin?
That sounds great. Everybody else, anybody else want to make any introductory remarks or?
Yeah, I had one comment on the master slave.
Yeah.
I think we need to look at it at a more micro level, not you know, as the way the whole society is organized, but rather at the level of individual interactions. And, you know, in economics, there's something called the fallacy of composition. And I think if you try to apply this to the way society as a whole is organized, you could fall victim to that, because just because like the individual interactions between people can be mediated this way doesn't mean that our whole society will be organized that way. Maybe the closest that you could come to this in like an actual interaction between people might be, as you guys said, like maybe between children, or, you know, a child first learning to follow the rules of society. And it seems like Hegel suggests at the end of this section that this is how learning begins, or the beginning of the learning process is this kind of bondage or slave situation where you are the one doing the work without really understanding why you're doing the work, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
I could also see it in a social sense, as far as like Aristotle says that leisure and slavery is necessary for thought, for philosophy to a certain extent. And so the Greeks, the leisured class, kind of have this philosophy, and yet at the same time, they're a bit not in touch with the basic aspects of life that are continuing their life, continuing their, I guess, existence, because it's entirely mediated through this other group.
Exactly. No, I think that's totally right. I think it is more the Greek society that Hegel's thinking of, or more these more primitive or ancient examples. And we have to understand that the master and the servant are both self-conscious, and so they're both the same. And so understanding one at the expense of the other, or in pure opposition to the other, is merely an abstraction, right? And it's an abstraction that will be overcome in the course of the dialectic. So we can't really transpose. So the master is self-consciousness, and the servant is self-consciousness, and so they are one. They're just different sides in an imbalance of self-consciousness trying to understand its truth. That is a transitional stage. But of course, it's a very influential transitional stage, more than most any other in here. Maybe some of the things that we're broaching are some of the reasons why people want to explore this in greater detail. But yeah, the master is an abstraction as much as the servant is an abstraction, and so nothing in, so to speak, concrete society corresponds to either one of these.
So I would like to stick to the fact that we're in logical developments here. So I like Garth's point about we shouldn't project this on everything. But I do want to go back to ancient history, since I studied it a great deal. And both the Romans and the Greeks had a view about a slave. A slave didn't have to be a slave. They could kill themselves. It was their choice to submit. So that was the ancients' view of slavery.
And that's, that is an interesting point. In war, even noblemen and the foreign masters of the defeated nation became slaves. So there was no. So it's a strictly relational existence, the existence of the slave. So masters become slaves, and slaves become masters all through history.
And if you didn't want to be a slave, you could die in battle. All right. Hey.
Hey, Richard.
Hey, Rich.
Hey.
Okay.
I
I'm
wanted
going
to
to
bring
put
something up.
phenomenology up on the screen here.
Let's see. I don't know what just happened, but Mike wanted to make a remark before we jumped in.
Yeah, just I forgot what you said, Philip. I think you said you were enthralled by Kojève, and I guess I felt the same way. Especially the first 6 pages or whatever that we read, I really liked how he was describing, I guess, yeah, the difference between the animal and the human, the how he was connecting desire, that sort of desiring of desire with love, and then how he was sort of describing the process of recognition. I really like that. It was really, I don't know, poetic. I guess the question, and I pose this to all of you, I guess, as we go through Hegel, I guess I was still questioning, like, that's an awesome explanation. I love it. But I wonder if Hegel actually wrote that, or if that was Kojève that is sort of embellishing or making more poetic.
That's to the point of the ambiguity of master-slave, because the notion of master-slave, that's a notion that just warms the cockles of the heart of any Marxist. So you can immediately jump to class consciousness, etc. And I don't think Hegel that I've read so far makes it all that explicit. And maybe I think it's both a strength and a weakness. The strength in the sense that by leaving these important points open, you can pour into it and inspire you to come up with your own philosophy. The weakness is the reverse of that. By leaving it open, you can divert it to your own preconceptions and make Hegel, force Hegel in sort of a Proustian bed of your own liking. That's why you have all these factions of right Hegelians, left Hegelians. But I think he leaves a lot open, and not sure that that's a strength, or it's both a strength and a weakness. And as far as Kojève is concerned, I believe what Philip said was that he found him intoxicating. And that's certainly true that Marxism, like fascism, is nothing if not intoxicating. And there's a danger associated with that.
Okay, Fred.
But
I think so.
Are you looking out for our well-being, Fred?
But now you've warned us against sirens of fascism and communism.
We should only be interested in politics that don't interest us.
But to set aside politics, I find Kojève, although he's described as a Marxist, he's a very interesting Marxist and a very idiosyncratic Marxist. And it's useful, and you can, I think, it seems to me from what I've read so far, you can read it without automatically falling into the throes of a pure Marxist doctrine. He has a lot of insights, I think.
Well, Marx too. And just because he's described as a Marxist doesn't mean he is one. I don't know of any Marxist that self-consciously says, well, you know, I'm a Kojèvian Marxist. I think every Marxist rejects Kojève, but it's still a label appended to him because of the reception history of his thought. You know, his thought really exploded into consciousness or on the public stage in post 45, right? And then everything was either Marxist or fascist or liberal, and there was that was the extent of one's descriptive category. So,
yeah, but I think Mike's point is well taken, that we should, in all cases, as we read Kojève or even in our discussions, take Hegel at his word and look at the text and see whether we ourselves, as well as Kojève, are reading something into the text that is by trying to fill up the spaces.
Excellent, yeah.
So last time we finished with 179, which 179 and 180 are kind of flow together. Michael, how do you want to start us off here? What do you think we should do?
I just followed the assignment, right? Started with, did we start with 181? Was that our assignment?
Yep. Okay. Shall we read?
Sure.
Does anybody remember whether we read this particular paragraph last time or not?
No, I thought we didn't read 180. I may have just gotten it wrong on the assignment, but in any event, we did not read 181 last time.
Okay, well, if there's any doubts about 180, let's just do it.
It looks like it would be good to start at 179 just because that seems like where this thought kind of starts.
Tyler, would you mind just reading us 179, 180, and 181? Just flow us all through all three. They're all like bound together.
Sure.
Good.
For self-consciousness, there is another self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is outside of itself. This has a twofold meaning. First, it has lost itself, for it is to be found as an other essence. Second, it has thereby sublated that other, for it also does not see the other as the essence, but rather sees itself in the other. It must sublate its otherness. This is the sublation of that first two-sided ambiguity, and is for that reason itself a second two-sided ambiguity. First, it must set out to sublate the other self-sufficient essence in order, as a result, to become certain of itself as the essence through having sublated the other. Second, it thereby sets out to sublate itself, for this other is itself.
Mm-hmm.
This double-edged sense of the sublating of its double-edged sense of otherness is likewise a double-edged sense of a return into itself. This is so in the first place because it gets itself back through sublation, for it comes to be in equality with itself again through the sublation of its otherness. However, in the second place, it likewise gives the other self-consciousness back to itself, since it existed for itself in the other, but it sublates its being in the other, and it thus sets the other free again.
I really like, by the way, I was thinking about Freud and his projection idea. In 179, I mean, Hegel knew about projection pretty clearly.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Wow. And the other thing is, you really do see this consciousness as a very, I'd say, egotistical, self-centered, like consciousness. You know, has to negate the other for its essence, for its truth. It really is a very constricted self-consciousness. It's not very evolved.
Right, and we have to remember why it's that way. He doesn't just throw it at us, right? It's a result of the development of the consciousness chapters, such that by the end of that, by the end of Force and Understanding, consciousness understands that what it took to be its object as other than it is only the reflection back to it of its own self-activity. So it's the activity of the knowing of consciousness, knowing the object that's reflected back to it as the other of itself, as the other of consciousness. And so in this, consciousness knows its object to be itself, that the object is now dependent on consciousness. And in knowing this, consciousness becomes self-consciousness. So now it knows that anything that appears to it as object is not the truth, but rather it itself is that thing's truth. And that primitive, complex but primitive construction is what is the first form of self-consciousness that Hegel calls desire. It is just that. It's just that, and since anything that is that appears other to it, this consciousness has already remembers what happened to it in the first three chapters, so to speak, and knows that it's not truly other, and so its appearance of otherness is an illusion. And at the stage of desire, consciousness actively, practically negates or annihilates, or negates that which appears other, thereby affirming its own truth. its own self-certainty, its own certainty that it is the truth of all things. So, and so that's just kind of the, these are the determinations that, or these are the properties that one has to think of as being all folded into self-consciousness. And and if you think all of those things together, you think desire. And then, and so desire is just a word for this particular complex unity. And as we proceed along, as we proceed from desire to recognition, recognition is just accepting the way in which that complex desire, which is an unstable complexity, it contains within itself tensions and contradictions, begin to play out. And as some of those are developed, we have now another complex form of self-consciousness called recognition, in which self-consciousness bifurcates into what appears to be two self-consciousnesses, each one having the exact same structure. And since it's the same structure, the appearance of two-ness belongs to the illusion. That's why he says this is the first expression of the first appearance of Geist, of spirit, the I that is we, that we that is I. Self-conscious isn't actually two, but because of the dialectic it's undergone, it is required that it duplicate it, so that it be outside of itself, such that from outside it is that which is outside can recognize that which that self-consciousness, that first self-consciousness. Okay, so I just wanted to say that's why this this desire, this self-consciousness seems very egotistical. It's egotistical because of what came before, and the kind of egotism we're actually talking about is the egotism of desire. The other is for me. It's means for my satisfaction. Everything is the means for my satisfaction. Any remarks or correctives or anything on that?
So desire still occurs at the animal level versus recognition. With recognition, we're at the human level per se.
I don't know how to answer that because it's not one of Hegel's distinctions.
This is a Kojevian distinction, right? He also ties desire to action, which doesn't seem clear in Hegel at this point.
I think it does act at the animal level, and at least for some animals in some senses, because it occurs to me that a much purer example of this logical structure of self-consciousness is not human to human, where psychology inordinately complicates the picture. I think of human and dog. For example, there's a movie which I highly recommend called Alpha, which if you're a dog lover, you got to see. It's about the earliest interaction of ancient man, I don't know, a few 10, 20,000 years ago, of ancient man with wolves or dogs, and the domestication process. And in that first encounter, it's very clear that man is the prey, the wolf is the predator. But because of the circumstances, it is turned around, that the man asserts himself as master and the dog as slave, and the domestication process is essentially to get the dog to do work for the man to obtain things or resources. And the culmination of it is this recognition that man is the master. The dog recognizes that it is the slave, in quotes. Both recognize that, that this is a necessary relationship, and both benefit from the relationship. So I think it does operate in some sense among animals, and in a lot of ways it seems like a purer example than we would obtain by simply considering humans and humans.
Brady, you raised your hand. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, I'm good. I was doing that by accident. I'm just trying to adjust my camera settings.
Okay, Garth, you're next then.
Oh, I'm not sure if what is the distinction being made if we just say self-consciousness is desire? Like, It seems to me that if we read that paragraph, that's near the beginning of the section, like 169, I think. This desire, this process of desire, is like sort of like self-consciousness trying to be certain of itself, and it like continually fixes on objects in order to search for this certainty. That seems to be what that paragraph is saying. Anyway.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe 160, let me see. I was reading it in Miller here. Oh, it's 167. Yeah.
Further back, okay.
It's like longer than a page.
Where are we talking about it?
That's when he says self-consciousness is desire in general.
Right.
Full stop. I think it says in this translation. Which is a very vague statement, it seems. I mean, maybe in his speaking, it's very clear, but
I think it makes sense, at least in that point of the text, where self-consciousness sees everything in itself. And so desire is saying that these things that exist out there are for me, and the destruction of them makes me take them back into myself and show that they're only a portion of my own self-consciousness.
But for me, in this sense, means like I cannot exist without these things. It's like this is what gives me my identity. That's how I read that for me. Not like for me just for me to eat or feel happy from. It's not that psychological. It's more like I can't exist without these things.
That's recognition, isn't it, Garth, though? Isn't that's the shift from desire to recognition?
Is it?
Isn't recognition recognizing the other as a self-consciousness
Yeah.
rather than as an object?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think so too.
Don't forget that the seeing other as means versus ends in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's coming up, so that's skipping ahead. Let's not do that, okay?
Yeah, I don't know. The perspective of consciousness thinks consciousness is consciousness of something. It's what phenomenologists call intentional, which is to say directed to something other. So consciousness is structurally other related. Right? And that other is that which, that other is, in Hegel's text, right? What's real. Consciousness isn't what's real, but the other is what's real. It has an independent existence. It's self-sufficient, right? And this is just a very rudimentary description of the fundamental structure of theoretical consciousness, as the Greeks understood it, right? That it is contemplative, it's observational, it's the gaze at the other that is the truth. And so here the object is where the truth lies. Now for practical, for all of us, when we're active, when we're desiring, we're not gazing at, so to speak, in wonder at the object, but we employ it. It presents itself to us in a different modality, not as the truth, but as what's useful. Useful to what? To me, right? And so here the object appears in an ontologically different modality. This is something that Heidegger explores too, between theoretical consciousness and practical consciousness, the hammer. So we're now into practical consciousness, where the object is always just a means to a means for consciousness or self-consciousness, and in that and so the object isn't where the truth is, where ultimate reality is. It's just a cog in the machine of self-consciousness's self-reproduction, which is for practical thought, self-consciousness is truth. And so it seems like, so I just want to kind of remind us that we've kind of changed territories from the object as true to the object as a means or an instrument to the truth being the self-replication or the self-maintenance of consciousness or a living being. So I wanted to make that, I just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, I think you can kind of think of, so Garth earlier said that it relies on the other, but in the practical mode, it understands the other as being itself. So it's not properly other, it's it's in a sense its own means of self-sustaining.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, God, I don't know who said this, if it was Lacan or someone else, but the stage of primitive narcissism, where the mother or the infant sees the mother as a part of itself.
Right, right.
I don't think there's the evolution of consciousness behind that we've seen from Hegel just yet. But on the other hand, there's also kind of an interesting perspective in the moving toward what would be called a cosmic narcissism, where I integrate myself into the entire universe,
right,
and see that as myself, and at the same time survive death through that.
Fascinating, yeah. Anybody want to piggyback on that?
Nice.
So self-consciousness is two things and one thing. Self-consciousness is consciousness, and therefore it's consciousness of an other. It's structurally tied to this otherness, but the other is not, but in self-consciousness, it's still consciousness. So it's consciousness of the other as itself, and it's consciousness of itself as the other. And so that gives us this two-sidedness that Hegel keeps talking about. And each time you try to resolve this two-sidedness, another two-sidedness opens. And that's kind of our clue that this is that this understanding of self-consciousness is an unstable one, just like force that needed another force to be understood, and that second force that was required needed the first force to be understood, and so each of them is incomprehensible through the other, and we get that whole dialectic. Here, the attempt for self-consciousness to grasp its nature, so to speak, leads to these imbalances that are propelling us forward. So Hegel's just kind of fleshing out, this whole self as other as self aspect of self-consciousness. And since the self and other are always somehow different, the unity of self-consciousness cannot yet find proper expression. And so that's why we have these ambiguities that, as it's stated here. So should we just look back at the text briefly and just make sure we understand, within that framework, that categorical framework that the book is prepared for us, what these ambiguities are and where they come from? That's my question. Go ahead and, if you want, or if everybody feels like they got it and we can move on too.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as right now it's in sort of a solipsistic existence. Because it's everything that it takes to be other is just itself. So there's a sense in which it's completely alone. And
Yeah.
So I'm curious how it escapes that, since you find a lot of people.
Well, I think we've already escaped it, right? Because we're in the recognition chapter.
Yeah, we're
so
escaping
it's already
it now,
acknowledged. It's already acknowledged that the object that it started off with, the object of desire, is is basically contained in the living system, right? Because of the Force and Understanding chapter, all we deal with now are guises of infinity. So self-consciousness is infinite, and the living system is infinite, and they're opposed to one another. And the self-conscious infinite knows itself to be the truth of the living system infinite. But it finds itself in asserting its truth over the living system to always be reproducing its own dependencies, right?
Mhm.
And so what it requires is an infinite object that negates itself, that it itself doesn't have to negate, right? And the infinite object that negates itself is namely itself, right? Self-conscious proved to be the negative, the negative infinity, the negative unity of infinity, whatever they called it at the end of that chapter, right? It is already pure self-negation as self-maintenance, or self-subsistence. And so what it needs is itself, but itself as other, because remember, there's this ambiguity between self and other, because self-consciousness is both consciousness and self-consciousness.
Yeah, I definitely see the negative infinite there, and a certain sense also that the self is asserting itself as all of reality. It's not yet acknowledging its own momentariness, and so it's stuck at this moment and can't reach all of the truth as truly everything.
Yes.
May we look at that second sentence in 180? I'm not sure what the first and second two-sided ambiguity is.
Do you mind just reading the sentences you're asking about?
Yeah. So 180, this is the sublation of that first two-sided ambiguity.
Okay. So what is it? It must sublate its otherness. Right. Now its otherness is ambiguous because its otherness is both other and itself. So in sublating its otherness, it's sublating not just its otherness, but it's sublating itself. That's the ambiguity here.
Okay.
I had to draw a picture. I don't know if this will come through. But the consciousness makes it as a subject and an object, but each of those things is self-consciousness. So way down, this is the structure of consciousness, the subject and an object. But since each of them is self-conscious, they have that inner structure each way. So that's sort of the two levels of doubling that I saw. Because in each of the side, there's two parts. Because it is self-consciousness.
How do we make Peter bigger? Everybody else gets bigger when they talk except Peter. So
all right.
I couldn't see the damn diagram.
First, you have to, Philip has to stop sharing screen.
Okay.
All right. And now we can go into speaker view, and Peter, go show that again.
You want me to show this thing up here?
Yeah, absolutely. Hold it there for a second.
It's hard to read.
So go ahead and describe that one more time for me.
So the very top thing says consciousness, and above the line is the structure of consciousness as a subject looking at an object.
Right.
If you put self-consciousness in both of those circles and take it down and sort of explode it out, that's self-consciousness looking at itself.
Right.
But way down in the inside here, that's supposed to be self-conscious. That's, again, self and other.
Right.
Which is what self-consciousness is. So all those circles are really just one thing, self-consciousness.
Exactly.
And it's so, but there's that sort of two level of doubling. One doubling of consciousness, and then within it, there's a further doubling.
So we read your arrows as sublation then?
Or some sort of relationship, at least, right?
Where the truth lies, where the essence is coming from.
Oh, that's good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I seem to remember, I think I heard Mike's voice there a little while back. Mike, do you want to get back in here or?
Oh, no, I'm good. No,
Okay.
intently. Thanks, sir.
So Philip, did we make any progress with your question, or we?
Yes, thank you. Yep. And thank you, Pete.
Yep, you can share your screen again, Philip. Go ahead.
Will do again. Yep.
So the sublation of the first two-sided ambiguity is itself a second two-sided ambiguity. So now we have to spell that out. What is it? I'm going to leave that to you guys.
As you're sublating what you think the other is, it's doing the same thing to you because it's other doing right back at you, kind of.
Exactly right. Yeah.
It's tit for tat in the iterated prisoner's dilemma, I think.
That's right. So my doing is a being done, and my being done is a doing. These are not two separate actions.
It's screwing yourself.
Passivity and activity coincide here, which is meant to tell us something about the nature of the self-activity that I was talking about before, the self-activity of which what appeared to be the object of consciousness is a mere reflection. So part of this book is spelling out what is this self-activity. It's not just like, I don't know. It's not just like when I move myself around the house. That's not the self-activity that Hegel's talking about. It's a very, very specific, to use Aristotle's term, it's a very specific actualization with an internally complex structure.
Should we go on to 182, Michael? Is that where you are? That's where the doing arises.
Sure. Any other questions before we get there? Or any other remarks you wanted to point out in the first three paragraphs? People?
181, just a point for myself at the bottom. It likewise gives the other self-consciousness back to itself.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. It's just like, yeah, I get it as a logical movement. I'm just trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm. So this, yeah.
And I have to resist the urge to psychologize, I think. Okay. Since self-consciousness, it's one structure now distributed over two poles. Anything that happens in the one pole happens in the other pole. So the return to self on one side is the return to self on the other side. All right. And the return to the self on either side is freeing itself from the dominance of the other side. Or dependence, yeah. Sounds a little bit like the north and south poles of the magnet.
I'll leave that one to experts.
No. Which Hegel used, right? Chapters ago.
Yeah, I don't remember the details.
It's all good. Okay. 182?
Yeah, so about everybody gets this idea, I assume, of the first sentence of 181. This whole idea of return to self is this because it's precise. I mean, this idea that negating the other is a return to self, but since it's happening on both sides, it's double.
Right. When you negate the otherness, you're sort of removing that relation of reliance on the other.
Right.
And so it becomes freestanding again.
Right.
And so it becomes itself. And so do you. But then, where am I?
And I think of this as the tar baby. Once you're free of the tar baby's free of you.
I have no idea what a tar baby is.
I have no idea what tar baby is either, but I'm afraid now to post this on YouTube. What the hell is tar baby?
You got to go back and read your Uncle Remus. So.
Uncle Remus? What the hell is that?
So a tar baby is like made out of straw, except it's got tar all over it. And once you grab the tar baby, you cannot. It's stuck. You're stuck. It's a tar baby.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
It's ancient history, Philip. I think Uncle Remus stories have been banned for a generation or two.
Oh,
Oh my God.
For
All right. All
cultural
right. All right.
insensitivity.
They were just fine before Disney got to them.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You can't get rid of that image, can you?
No, can't. All right, let's read 182. Who wants to volunteer?
I'll do it.
Cool.
In this way, this movement of self-consciousness in its relation to another self-consciousness has been represented as the doing of one self-consciousness. But this doing on the part of one self-consciousness has itself a twofold significance of being its own doing just as well as it is the other's doing. For the other is just as self-sufficient. The other is just as enclosed within himself, and there is nothing within him which is not there through himself. The first does not have the object before it in the way that the object only is initially for desire. Instead, it has an object existing for itself self-sufficiently. For that reason, it can do nothing on its own about that object if that object does not do in itself what the first self-consciousness does in it. The movement is thus straightforwardly the double movement of both self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as he does. Each himself does what he demands of the other, and for that reason also does what he does only insofar as the other does the same. A one-sided doing would be useless because what is supposed to happen can only be brought about through both of them bringing it about. End of story.
Is
Thanks, Fred.
there anything new in that paragraph?
Maybe,
Well, the doing is new.
Mm-hmm.
and maybe, I don't know if this is just a throwaway word, but this movement of self-consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
describing it as a movement.
that's the instability, isn't it, Michael?
Yeah. I think that's true.
Yeah, the one-sided doing would be you. So if you don't have the other, you have no means of doubling. You have no means of sublating. You like none of these issues can arise without the doubling. So the one-sided doing, you're not going to arrive at consciousness or self-consciousness at all.
Wouldn't you mean consciousness, but not self-consciousness?
I think that might be right. I can't remember. So, but yeah, you're not going to get self-consciousness without this doubling.
Mm-hmm.
Self-consciousness is the doubling more.
Right.
Not
Yes.
like it anyway, but yeah.
But before, with desire, we had the movement of negation. Negation is a dynamic term, but it's also a logical term insofar as it doesn't happen. There's no certain moment of time that it happens, but rather self-conscious as desire is constitutionally the negation of the object. But the object didn't negate back.
It was life. Wasn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Life was
So
a
the object didn't negate back. And so in that sense, it wasn't a reflection of of desire. But now we have the object that is a reflection of self-consciousness, and what it does, it's no longer desire because it no longer negates the object, but needs the object, but requires the object to negate itself.
I see in this like some kind of emergence of like a social reality, because without this like mirrored doing of the self-consciousness is basically claiming itself to be the cause of what occurs, but it isn't. That's only like an appearance, because the other self-consciousness is also doing that same thing.
Right.
So there's a tension there.
Totally.
Definition of
Yeah.
recognition.
Yeah. I think there's too, like, possibly, like, whereas before with life, we could just consume it, and the moment was consuming it for me. At this point, I need the other life to watch me consume it in order to assert myself.
Sort of like if you're doing a performance, like you need the audience in order for there to be a performance, and in order for there to be an audience, there needs to be a performance. I don't know,
Right.
this example. So
Exactly. It's like the
exactly
force.
itself.
That's just the same example as force, the soliciting and the solicited force.
Okay,
Yes.
the magnets, right?
And so in other words, it's like a false. It's a false opposition.
Yeah. Oh my God, there's bugs on my computer. I might have to go back inside.
Perhaps we should read 183, since it's really one sentence which recapitulates 182 and addresses what we're talking about. The doing thus carries not only a double-edged sense inasmuch as it is a doing directed as much towards itself as it is directed towards the other, but also inasmuch as it is just as much and separately the doing of one as well as the doing of the other.
Right. It's not two doings.
Right. Two aspects of one doing.
Right. And why do we have two aspects? Right. Because of the inner ambiguity of self-consciousness, because it's consciousness, and as consciousness, it's conscious of another, but the other is self. And so that which you're conscious of in self-consciousness is an unstable unity duality, or duality unity. And that's the motor of the movement, or what causes all this complication.
Doing is an awkward construction. I think let me see, in the Miller translation, the word is action.
Yeah, that's so there in German we have the distinction between tun, to do something, and handeln, which is to act, and so tun, deed, comes from doing, and an activity comes from action, and these two different verbal words, I think, are very important for Hegel to keep apart.
So which one is in Hegel? Which one does Hegel use in this?
Right now, at this point, he's using tun.
Oh yeah.
And later in the reason chapter or the spirit chapter, he'll bring in Handlung, right, as a more.
Yeah, well, Germans love those gerunds, which are kind of awkward in English, but maybe that is a better translation, closer to
Right. I mean, in 182, he does have kind of a wordplay when he calls it the doing of the one, right? When we represent that, we think, when he says the doing of the one, we think it's the doing of one side of this opposition, right? But he just says it's the doing of the one. It's one doing. And this opposition, there's no real opposition going on here, right? But it's just necessitated on us because of the way in which the dialectic has proceeded. But you could also, the doing of the one, I mean, you can almost think of this as Platonic, whatever the one is, and it will presumably end up being spirit, it's the doing of that. But at this less adequate stage, it seems like it's the doing of the one self-consciousness as directed into two pseudo self-consciousnesses. So, I mean pseudo only in the sense that they don't have independent existence of one another.
Yeah, the strange thing is, as you go through these different movements, in the dialectic, things will only seem necessary at certain levels, but at the end, it's all going to be necessary for the whole thing to even get started.
Yeah.
And that's why I was having trouble earlier with self-consciousness and consciousness, because I think it's necessary for consciousness, but we just don't see it at that level yet.
Hey, Fred is going. Bye, Fred. See you later, man. Thanks for hanging.
Thanks, Fred. Great to see you.
Hi, Fred.
See you, Fred.
So what's the doing? So what is the doing that's being done? What is the actual doing?
So the doubling and the sublating is what I'm taking that to be.
So yeah, so he says
That's the doing is the movement.
Yeah.
Top of 182.
So Hegel reminds us that we've been representing rather than conceiving, and in representing we imagine self-conscious on one side, self-conscious on the other side, right? And we imagine them as two separate individual. We've been individuating them all along in our representation, but he reminds you that that's just a product of representing them. Thinking
This is
them.
kind of like syllogisms, where you predicate something of something, but what you're saying is they're really one, but you represented them
Right.
as two.
Right.
So this ends up all being one movement, even though we've got two things doing at first seemingly different movements, but they both rely on the other's movement, and it all ends up one movement.
Mm-hmm. So now we have this structure where where self-consciousness is aware of itself, or is conscious of itself in another self-consciousness. And that is self-consciousness. Does anyone have a problem with that? Just the fact that it's distributed over two poles doesn't make it a self-conscious of a self is self-consciousness, whether it's happening in my body or between bodies. Right? So each one is what the other one is. And at this point, since self-consciousness is truth, is only affirmable through another self-consciousness. Each self-consciousness is what it really is only through the other. I'm gonna let that sink in for a second. Make sure everybody is happy with it. Anybody want to say anything, or is...
Yeah, I'm definitely ending up just thinking about the Parmenides, of course.
Here we go.
I can't help myself.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of this time thinking about some things that Gersten said, like the difference between sameness and identity. It's like I spent all day yesterday thinking about that and couldn't come to some conclusions about whether there is actually identity in being or if it only is something that you find in appearances. And anyway, that's like...
I think it's magnetic. This should resonate with all of that, because all of that is what we're talking about. And we're just doing it in Hegel's more colorful language.
Yes.
So each is what it is only through the other. So the other is necessary for self-consciousness to be. But that's with both of them. And Hegel does mention somewhere, maybe we've already passed it, he says that this is just, oh yeah, this is exactly what we saw in the play of forces.
Yeah.
So maybe, unless anybody wants to question or probe or confute what I just said, or bring out anything else in 182, 183.
So that's the one-sided doing, Michael, that you just spoke about, right? The last sentence, the one-sided doing useless, because what is supposed to happen can only be brought about through both of them bringing it about.
Right. So up until this paragraph, we've only been talking about self-consciousness, and we've been taking the perspective of self-consciousness, and we've been thinking about this other as being somehow external to that self-consciousness, and that self-consciousness needs to affirm its own truth, but is nevertheless somehow outside of it. And Hegel said, by the way, guys, we've just been representing. We haven't really been thinking, right? This is just we've been representing, and therefore that other has we've let that other appear as something different and other than the self-consciousness whose perspective we've adopted. And he said that, and he said this is, and he pointed out that is an abstract, or that's an abstraction from what's really going on. It is one self-consciousness. It's one self-consciousness in relationship to another that is also self. Yeah. And then the way of saying that is that each one, either side is both sides.
Yeah, they each have to be, so in order for self-consciousness to recognize itself, it has to be duplicate, it has to be itself and that which is recognized.
Mm-hmm.
But to recognize it as itself, it has to understand the other as being the same as itself.
Right.
So it needs to understand in what regard are they the same.
Yeah. Are we all ready for 184? Or do you want to stay with this a minute? Anybody? If anybody's just completely confused, now's a really good time to pipe up.
If I can just add another point here, a little off topic, but why Luther threw out confession as a sacrament? And yet this is exactly, this is the sacramental aspect of confession right here that's being talked about. The encounter with another person as constitutive of what it is to be human. And the Protestants who threw out a bunch of stuff threw out this. It's a different, I guess I'm thinking about Hegel as fundamentally relational in all his approach and thought.
I think Hegel says something like, anything that is immediate is just as much mediated. So I think that's in a sense correct.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have to remember that the external relations and internal relations and different. So when we say relational, we're being a little bit vague. So in a sense, you're right. In a sense, it's not specific enough because the kind of relation that Hegel's talking about are negativity, sublation, mediation. These are and these are all built into one another. So it's relational without it's relations without poles, and
I was thinking more of the I as we and the we as I.
Yeah, I mean that's another example of the exact same. To think of I as opposed to we, or even the I as being part of we, or whatever. I mean, thinking of them as in some sense distinguishable from one another is, so to speak, is part of the representational abstraction. Yeah, so
we're going to end. So Jacobinism is like a representational error. I mean, that's where we end up.
Yeah, we just have to think the kind of representation, and when we think the kind of representation, then when we Hegelians say everything's in relation, we're going to mean something other than the therapist who's going to say, you are nothing but your all the relations you're in, or something like that, because all those other poles of that relation are accorded an independent existence from the therapist's point of view, but not from the Hegelian point of view.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Thank you.
$184.
184. Who wants to read?
I suppose I'll read again. If nobody else volunteers, I'll just read.
I can read.
Okay.
It seems like everyone pipes up and wants to read before me, so
I'll go for it.
Your time to shine, Garth.
184, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
In this movement, we see the process repeat itself, which had been exhibited as the play of forces in consciousness. What existed for us in that process is here for the extremes themselves. The mediating middle is self-consciousness, which disintegrates into the extremes. And each extreme term is this exchange of its own determinateness and the absolute transition into what is its opposite. However, as consciousness, it does indeed get outside of itself, but in its being outside of itself, it is at the same time kept back within itself. It is for itself, and its self-externality is for it. It is for consciousness that it immediately is and is not an other consciousness. Likewise, this other is only for itself as it sublates itself as existing for itself, and it is for itself only in the being for itself of the other. Each is the mediating middle to the other, through which each mediates itself with itself and integrates itself with itself. Each is to itself and in that of the other, an essence immediately existing for itself, which at the same time is for itself in that way only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other.
Wow.
And so wait a minute, if he can see me, I can see him, or the other way around.
Yeah, if I can see him, he can see me. And I guess it is the other way around. Because then you recognize that they recognize that, and so on. It seems like an infinite process to me. Does anyone else read it that way? That sort of occurred to me halfway through the reading, and I almost lost where I was reading.
Well, you mean bad infinity or good infinity? Because he mentions the good infinity, I think, earlier.
I don't know. But it seems like it doesn't end. I mean, we keep going.
Okay, like, yeah, that would be the indefinite.
Yeah, but the recognition structure is complete before you start adding iterations of it that are just replications of the same. So going to, so to speak, to the next level is just superfluous to the structure of recognition, right? That is already complete in the first level. So he said it is an infinite relation, but it's not an infinite regress.
Yes.
That's what I want to say.
That's a good versus a bad infinity. Infinite regress being the bad.
Yeah, and I think the way we've been saying infinite in the good sense is limited by itself, and what we have here is a structure of finding out the sense in which the other is itself, and so its own limitation is its self-relation. That's its own limit, thus it's infinite.
So the third sentence, what are the extremes?
Each self-consciousness.
Oh, yeah, right. So each self-consciousness is
yes.
So self and other, but they're both self.
And they're mediating themselves too.
Right. So each one of them has an unstable structure. So that's two unstable structures. And the structure between them is the same unstable structure. So the structure between them is the structure that's within each one of them. And so on the one hand, you can say, if you want to count, we have three structures, three unstable structures. But since they all are mirror images of one another, it's one unstable structure. And so that's where you get the three terms. That makes, because
that's the Trinity, right?
That's the Trinity. Well, this is the as yet unstable Trinity.
Wow, that's interesting, Pete.
Well, I can't believe Philip didn't jump in on that before me.
I know. You stole it from where? Peter, you said you stole it.
From Philip.
Ah, okay.
Because that's a remark that he usually makes, and I had to make it for him.
Thanks, Pete.
You're getting slow in your old age or something.
No question about that.
what questions or what remarks does anybody have about 184?
So they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other is where that is the escape from the solipsistic understanding of oneself.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, just one always good reminder. As we advance into the phenomenology, we always are uncovering the more fundamental unity, that is the unity of the oppositions that we just went through. And so we can call that more fundamental unity, or I will call it a ground, the ground of the subreption, or not of the diremption. And so as we go through the phenomenology, we're finding the conditions of the possibility of what came before, right? So one way to look at this is to think that, well, that recognition is well, self-consciousness is deeper unity of consciousness and makes consciousness possible. And reason will be the deeper unity, and spirit will be the even deeper unity. So we're always, so in a sense, well, that's all I want to say about that. I think it's sometimes helpful to think that what we're doing is we're not adding information, but we're going deeper into the unities that make these multiplicities or these oppositions possible.
Right. At the moment, I can't help but think like we're working down towards the ground, which would be
right,
and that's going to be the one that is my suspicion in the Platonic sense.
So then the conclusion, so to speak, of this argument that we're tracing backwards is that there is like here and now, right? That will be what we
right.
can conclude from the one or spirit or whatever we find is the ultimate.
I mean, ultimately, one can think of it this way: recognition is the full concept of self-consciousness, and therefore, recognition. There's no self-consciousness without recognition, and therefore, the self-consciousness of desire that opposed the life system as its infinite object is not the predecessor of recognition, but the consequent of recognition. You can only be self-conscious via recognition. And so this first gestalt, this first guise of self-consciousness we had at the beginning, we called desire, that was opposed to the life object. That is actually logically later. I mean, that is derivative of of recognition. That relation is dependent on a prior relation. What relation is it dependent on? Recognition. Recognition itself is going to be dependent on a prior relation that we're going to get to, and so on. Because I think people like to read this, they like to think they're little natural histories and think, oh yeah, well, there's the like little single cell organisms and they're all desiring and they all eat each other and blah, blah, blah. And then eventually one of them just becomes self-conscious, and then then it stands over against the life system as its infinite object, right? And that's just, that's a product of evolution or history or whatever, right? But part of the point that Hegel's making is it's precisely the opposite.
So we're doing philosophy sort of in the way Kant wanted us to here.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, we're focused on necessary relations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's like a movement too here from, I don't know, consumption to recognition, whereas before I had to destroy my object, but at this point I need to preserve it in order to recognize myself, and even come to a moment of self-destruction where I risk everything so that this other thing can watch me posit my own necessity outside of my, I don't know where I was quite going with that, but.
Seems right to me. One Aristotelian way of making the prior point is that we're just getting further, we're getting closer and closer to what's first in nature. And so as we go through this book, we're getting closer and closer to what's first in nature, or first in being, or first in reality, or whatever else, right? And so
In
it's
terms of the matter.
that which is first is explanatory of what is second and third and all the rest of it. So we're going deeper into the unity of the explanation of the whole.
Right,
And
that
so
would be in
what
Gerson
what happens
terms.
late is first for us, and it seems so familiar, but we're moving towards what's first in nature, in order to understand how it's even possible to have an awareness, a conscious awareness of a sensible particular as the truth.
So in Gerson terms, that would be working towards the unhypothetical.
Yes, exactly right.
So sense certainty is last in nature.
Yes. And therefore first for us.
Wow.
The last will be first and the first will be last.
Oh no.
Peter, damn. Peter, you truly have the keys today.
For
No.
mine, anyway.
This is awful. You know, if we were doing this in the evening, it would have just driven me to whiskey.
We ready for 185?
Yeah, let's do it. And unless anybody else wants to say anything about 184. Okay, let's read 185. Who would like to read who hasn't?
I can read.
Excellent, thanks.
This pure concept of recognition, the pure concept of the doubling of self-consciousness in its unity, is itself now up for examination according to how its process appears for self-consciousness. It will first of all exhibit the aspect of inequality between both of them, or the mediating middle breaking apart into the extremes, which are, as extremes, opposed to each other, and of which one is only recognized while the other only recognizes.
That's kind of a preview of things to come. Should we read one more paragraph?
Yeah, so it's only that last phrase that's new there in 185, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the return to force, but at a higher level.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, and that's interesting. Maybe we need to think about that when we come to it. You know, force in the unstable construct of force, or in the concept of force, each side is both sides, and so they are mirror images of each other. But an inequality, or what does he call it? So an inequality doesn't develop between the master force and the slave force, right? So, but now we've got the same mirroring thing going on, but the resolution of that mirror will not be the infinite as it was for forces, because we're already in the infinite and we're just working out the infinite. So the resolution of this mirroring will have to take on a different structure, and maybe we can put our fingers on exactly where the difference is, but it's just something to note.
But in force, wasn't it like one of the things that were mirrored sort of opposites in some sense?
The solicited and the soliciting?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of the moments. Never mind. I was thinking the positive and negative were opposites, therefore they didn't have the same structures here in self-conscious, but that's wrong. Never mind.
I mean, I think there's part too with the oscillation between one is solicited and one is soliciting, and one here is oh, what's that?
I'm not sure there's a what.
Oh, well, then I'm good. Where they talk about the inequality between both of them, breaking apart into extremes, where one becomes the solicited, one becomes the soliciting, and there's, I guess, not quite a domination, but activity exists on one side rather than the other. exchanging of activity and passivity.
Say that again.
Oh, so with force, we have solicitation and solicited. One is active, one is passive. And here we have that move to the opposition of individuals, where the extremes are opposed to each other, but one is only recognized while the other is only recognizing. And so there's kind of that oscillation between the two, similar to what we saw in force, where one solicits the other, but then we find out that the solicited is also the soliciting.
I think in this movement, I think we find out that the passive and the active are also each respectively active and passive as well, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a higher movement than the movement of force, but at the same time, I guess a repetition of it, but at the level of self-consciousness.
Yeah.
At 185, that last sentence at 185, like this wraps up social media. One is only recognized and the other only recognizes.
Oh, God. Well, let's read 186 and see what happens.
All right. Self-consciousness is at first simple being for itself, and it is self equal through the exclusion from itself of all that is other to itself. Its essence and absolute object is the I. And within this immediacy, or within this being of its being for itself, it is a singular being. What is other for it is, as an inessential object, designated by the character of the negative. However, the other is also a self-consciousness, and that what comes on the scene here is an individual confronting an individual. In the way that they immediately make their appearance, they are for each other in the way ordinary objects do. They are self-sufficient shapes absorbed within the being of life. For the existing object has here been determined to be life, which for each other have not yet achieved the movement of absolute abstraction. They have not yet achieved the destruction of all immediate being, and of being themselves only the purely negative being of self-equal consciousness, or they have not yet presented themselves to each other as pure being for itself, which is to say, as self-consciousness. Each is, to be sure, certain of itself, but not of the other, and for that reason, its own certainty of itself is still without truth. For its truth would be only if its own being for itself were to itself to have exhibited itself as a self-sufficient object, or, what is the same thing, that the object would have turned out to be this pure certainty of itself. However, according to the concept of recognition, this is not possible without the other being for it in the way it is for the other, without each in itself achieving this pure abstraction of being for itself, without each achieving this through its own activity, and again through the activity of the other.
Okay, so this is different than force because in the solicited and the soliciting, they are not self-sufficient. They each reciprocally require the other. In this case, they don't. However, the self-recognition of themselves as being self-sufficient requires the self-sufficiency of the other.
Excellent. Right. So, does everybody follow that? It's
Would you
like
mind repeating?
it's like how do you conceive two all-powerful beings? What kind of relationship are they going to have to one another, right? And since each one is through itself and not through another, that's constitutes their being for self. The way in which I can't quite get this thought, but it seems to me clear that in the collision of two all-powerful beings, or those beings that are through themselves, that are their own power, that you won't get a sublation into something higher, because there is nothing higher like we had in force, but you will have this inequality, or this differential in power, as the result of their coexisting.
Yeah, so the difference in structure between the force and self-consciousness was in the force. I'm just repeating what Tyler said, I guess, is that in force, the soliciting and the solicited were in some sense outside each other, and they could only be stable in these two opposites coming together. Whereas in self-consciousness, that's already all within one thing. And so the one side, in a sense, the one individual is already self-sufficient or self-standing.
Yes.
Or at least it believes itself to be.
Well, it can't, the problem is it can't know itself to be self-sufficient without the other. So it can't find its own truth without the other. But the other also has to share in this structure.
I don't want to get too focused on the difference to force and understanding. I just wanted to point that out. But anything else you see new developing in this particular 186 paragraph?
I'm still thinking about your comment about infinity, sort of like coming into conflict with itself, or all powerful coming into conflict with itself. In mathematics, you can have something like an indeterminate form, and one of them is like infinity minus infinity. Like that could equal any number.
Mm-hmm.
And these forms arise in like limits and like in calculus, because you're not really supposed to just write infinity down and treat it like a number. But when you're working with a limit, then you could have something that can calculate out in this way. And what it means is you need to rewrite that equation or that expression in a different way so that that ambiguity is removed. This clash is itself a kind of an ambiguity. So I see maybe this is sort of like a generalization of that concept. This clash, this mirroring of these two self-sufficient beings is ambiguous. It's not determinate in sufficiently determinate to be like knowledge. It needs to be explored more and put in a different way so that this can be resolved. And I don't know. It seems like a bold claim that this is the origin of the notion of inequality itself. But
it seems like the first, like about 4 sentences are like, okay. And then we get down to this long sentence. They are self-sufficient shapes absorbed within the being of life. And then it begins to loop when it hits, which for each other have not yet achieved the movement of absolute abstraction. The movement of absolute abstraction. They have not yet achieved the destruction of all immediate being, and of being themselves only the purely negative being of self-equal consciousness. Or they have not yet presented themselves to each other as pure being. They have not yet presented themselves to each other as pure being for itself, which is to say as self-consciousness.
Right. So each one of them is for the other still the object of desire, which is to say, a living organism or an ecosystem, a member of the ecosystem, right? And that's these, since the ecosystem isn't the absolute abstraction or the absolute self-negation, which is self-consciousness. Self-consciousness at the desire stage saw itself as opposed to an other that wasn't self-conscious. It was just infinite. It was just life. And so it seems to me like Hegel is saying that until they present each other, the self-consciousnesses present each to the other as being pure for itself, being pure negation of the other. Each self-consciousness relates to the second self-consciousness as part of that living system, and that living system is not self-conscious. It's not pure for itself. It's not absolute self-negation, pure infinite negativity. So each one of these self-consciousnesses is still looking at the other as a life form that it subjugates, just like as desire did.
I like this paragraph because what I see in it is he's sort of progressing through, what is it, the first simple being for itself. That's the first sentence in that paragraph. Then at the end, I guess he closes with the arrival of self-consciousness at the moment that they recognize the other self-consciousness. And
Right. So, yeah, in the first sentence, it also says, the first being for itself, it is self-equal through the exclusion from itself of all that is other. But if you're gonna know that you are this, that you have this character, you must encounter the other.
Oh, great, Tyler. Thank you. Right. Yes. But then on, what is other for it is an inessential object.
What is other for it is, I mean, part of the process is that it thinks the other is an inessential object at first, but comes to know it as being itself self-consciousness. So it reflects, so in order for it to be self-consciousness, that other has to end up being consciousness. Otherwise, it would be conscious only of other.
What are you thinking, Philip?
If it was not self-consciousness, it would be consciousness only of the other.
Correct. I mean, if the other doesn't turn out to be consciousness, then there is no self-consciousness, because the self isn't conscious of itself. It's still only conscious of the other. The other has to turn out to be self-consciousness.
Oh, right. Oh.
In the middle of that paragraph, each is, to be sure, certain of itself, but not of the other. And for that reason, its own certainty of itself is still without truth. And that's what it's all about. Self-conscious wants to understand itself as the truth because that's what it was saddled with by the consciousness chapters. Right? Still without truth, for its truth would be only if its own being for itself were to itself to have exhibited itself as a self-sufficient object, or what is the same, that the object would have turned out to be this pure certainty of itself. Okay. So it's only when the object turns out to, of itself, affirms the certainty of self-consciousness, of being all truth, or being the truth, that its being for itself will have certainty, or will be the truth.
So what, that last sentence that goes, however, this is like another turn here. However, according to the concept of recognition, this is not possible without the other being for it in the way it is for the other.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's so again, like that would be if the other turns out not to have the structure of consciousness for consciousness, then there would be no self-consciousness. Because the consciousness has to have as its object something that is indeed consciousness for it to be self-conscious.
For it to be self-consciousness. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, both sides are the same.
Right. And the relationship between them is the
Yes.
same as each one of
Yeah.
them.
The Trinity again, yes.
Thanks, Pete. By the way, that sentence just before the one we read, the purely negative being is self-equal consciousness. When in Faust, when Faust asked Mephistopheles who Mephistopheles is, Mephistopheles says, "I'm the spirit that negates." This is an entirely different meaning of that phrase than I had ever run across before. Well, that would change the whole thing. What's going on with Faust? Well, okay.
Yeah, I haven't read Faust. I should get around to reading Goethe at some point.
They
It's
were
not like
buds.
you don't have enough to read. All right. Should we try to get another paragraph done, or does anybody want to say anything else about that paragraph?
I'm ready for the next
And
paragraph.
he's setting up the struggle for life and death, right?
It's a long one here. Okay.
All right, who wants to read?
Mike?
Oh, I was waving to Brady, but I'll read. However, the exhibition of itself as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness consists in showing itself to be the pure negation of its objective mode, or in showing that it is fettered to no determinate existence, that it is not at all bound to the universal singularity of existence, that it is not shackled to life. This display is the doubled act, namely, both what the other does and what is done through oneself. To the extent that it is what is done by the other, each thus aims at the death of the other. However, the second aspect is also therein present, namely, what is done through oneself, for the former involves putting one's own life on the line. The relation of both self-consciousnesses is thus determined in such a way that it is through a life and death struggle that each proves its worth to itself, and that both prove their worth to each other. They must engage in this struggle, for each must elevate its self-certainty of existing for itself to truth, both in the other and in itself. And it is solely by staking one's life that freedom is proven to be the essence, namely, that as a result, the essence for self-consciousness is proven to be not being, not the immediate way self-consciousness emerges, not its being is absorbed within the expanse of life, but rather it is that there is nothing present in itself which could not be a vanishing moment for it, that self-consciousness is only pure being for itself. The individual who has not risked his life may admittedly be recognized as a person, but he has not achieved the truth of being recognized as a self-sufficient self-consciousness. As each risks his own life, each must likewise aim at the death of the other, for that other no longer counts to him as himself. To himself, his essence exhibits itself as that of another. He is external to himself, and he must sublate that being external to himself. The other is a diversely entangled and existing consciousness. He must intuit his others as pure being for itself or as absolute negation.
What a great paragraph.
Yeah, I think that not it's being absorbed, things are moving within the expanse of life, but rather it is that there is nothing present in itself, which could not be a vanishing moment for it. That self-consciousness is only pure being for itself. So this is how it requires, not only does it require the other, but it has to turn the other into something like a moment for itself, for it to recognize itself as being for itself. So there's nothing present in itself which could not be a vanishing moment for it. Otherwise, it has to recognize any vanishing moment. No, I'm lost. Never mind.
Okay. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
So it has to, so the exhibition of itself as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness, which is to say, pure being for itself, which is to say, not being for another, which is to say, not being immediate, having no immediacy, being pure mediation, being pure self-mediation. That's what he calls later freedom. As how is that exhibited? Consists in showing itself to be the pure negation of its objective mode, right? Or in showing that it is fettered to no determinate existence. We always saw that self-consciousness was always, its object was the infinite as life system, right? That's the determinate existence here. And the self-conscious is itself part of this life system and opposed to this life system, as we saw in the whole desire thing, because it is a living being, but it is also the negation of all immediate being, including living being. So it is fed to no determinate existence that is not at all bound to the universal singularity of existence, that it is not shackled to life.
Right. Okay, that's why the determinate being has to be shown to be vanishing moments.
Yeah. I agree, but do you want to explain your thought?
Well, yeah, it can only know that they're vanishing moments if it engages with them.
And what are them now at this point? Just any
Determinate, like
right.
Anything it takes to be the other.
Mm-hmm.
Anything it takes to be other is going to end up having to be determinate in some sense.
Is it?
I think so.
I don't know. I mean, maybe you're right. I'm not sure how it illuminates the passage, but maybe you do. Maybe you know.
So it has to take something as another, which means it has to be taken as some one thing in relation to itself.
Okay.
So in that sense, the other in that moment is a determinate existence.
Yeah. All right.
Am I taking this the wrong way? I'm not sure.
No. I just I happen to think this determinate existence is more determinate than what you're giving it. It seems to me like any other for self-consciousness is going to have some kind of determinate existence, but we're talking about a very specific determinate existence, namely life.
Okay.
Well, so self-consciousness goes beyond life.
Right.
Almost opposed to life. That's too strong, but
Right, no, yes, it is.
Right. For it to be infinite, it can't be limited by life.
yeah, it's
Mhm.
moved beyond that moment.
That's why it aims at the death of the other, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, it wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And because anything it does to the other, it does it to itself. By exposing the other to death, it exposes itself to death. And in doing that, it exhibits its not being shackled to life or its superiority over life and death. And thereby not being, there's no immediacy that it's shackled to. It is pure being for self. It is
Yes.
pure, it is pure freedom.
This is Thanatos, right?
I don't know, is it?
Right. It just seems like the Freudian death drive or something. Right?
Ah.
I don't know how Freud defined that exactly, but you know, it is like the subconscious seeking of death. It's not really a desire to suicide. It's a kind of a desire for a certain kind of freedom, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's the essential thing. And it's not like freedom, like the ability to move around, but that self-consciousness is not dependent on any determinate thing. Yeah, so because otherwise it wouldn't be self-consciousness. That's the thing. It's trying to affirm that self-consciousness, and if it were dependent on something, it would be limited. And if it limited, it wouldn't be a guise of the infinite. And if it were not the guise of the infinite, it wouldn't be self-consciousness. So all of these requirements are being loaded up and propelling us into this space of battle.
So it's not so much forcing the other to submit. The issue is that in the battle with the other, one risks one's own life. That's the essential moment. That's where one negates all determinants.
Right. That's the affirmation of being for self. Right.
Yes.
All right, so the display is the doubled act, namely both what the other does and what is done through itself. Okay, so we've got that. So we've got the exposure to death on both sides. And then a little bit later on, they must engage in the struggle, for each must elevate its self-certainty of existing for itself to truth. Yeah, existing that's just being. It's just we should just say being for itself. Just this whole switching back and forth between being and existing can somehow sometimes confuse things.
Okay, yeah, that helps, because the existing makes it, it's misleading.
Right.
We're starting to get a bunch of words here for the individual. I mean, he uses the word one in this paragraph. I think it's the first time he uses the word existence. I don't know. It feels new to me. And he also uses the word person, and he uses the word individual in the prior. So these are terms that he's using for the first time, and he's also differentiating among them.
Mm-hmm. So scratch existing. It just means it's just being. Hegel's using being all the way through here.
Okay, there's nothing separate meant. Okay.
Right. Or rather, if you see the word existing, don't be tempted to think it means anything other than being, the way in which being has been used throughout this book. Yes, I can't quite figure out why he brings up person here.
Because there's person, and then in that same sentence, there's individual, and then there's the Latin individuum used in the prior paragraph, and he's driving at some distinction here, and the translator's obviously wrestling with it, not quite sure how to go.
Yeah, I don't think we're talking about individual people.
Well, but didn't he say that in part of that distinction that the person could be not self-conscious in some sense? There's some.
Yeah, he has not achieved the truth of being the person as opposed to the individual. or the person, he has not achieved the truth of being recognized as a self-sufficient self-consciousness.
I'm thinking now of something like we have an idea of like how to treat like strangers, which is like fundamentally different from how we treat people we're actually close to, you know. And even like if you have like a circle of friends, you know, you can have people that you're really close to and people that you're not really close to, you know. And like, you know, we deal with most people in a very guarded way, but you know, in order to really get to know somebody, you have to like expose your vulnerabilities to them. They expose their vulnerabilities to you. And I feel like this is sort of what he's getting at here, and why he brings up this thing of being recognized as a person, to contrast with this more fundamental recognition that he's talking about.
So this more fundamental requires being at risk, requires the self being at risk.
Yeah, that's how I see it. You know, like in order for two men to make friends, they this is Zizek's example, right? So he thinks, you know, you have to make a dirty joke or insult the guy, and then that the guy will know that you really want to be close with him. He'll insult you back or something, and then you can overcome that just personness and become like individuals seeing each other, I guess. I don't know.
No, that's interesting. Okay, I had not actually considered the thought that person is kind of general and anonymous, whereas the individual is personalized, or not personalized, but individual is somehow more concrete. I hadn't considered that angle. That's interesting. So an individual.
The person is more like Das Mensch.
Pardon me?
The person is more like Das Mensch.
Yeah, I'm not. You know, just thinking the Latin persona, right? Just as a mask, as a social role that anybody can fulfill. Now, that's what a person is if you adopt those certain rules. But that's not. But being a person is not being an individual. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. I have to think about this paragraph again, focusing on that. I hadn't before. I don't really have anything good to say about that.
So Garth, then when we go to the grocery store, right, we're persons. We don't, I mean, no one wants to, I don't want to count the teller as someone other than a person, and the teller does not want to counter me as someone other than a person. They want the persona, that's it.
Right.
Is the person just the other?
Person would be like the appearance. So yeah, it's because the individual that may admittedly be recognized as a person, but the matter of whether they've achieved this truth of being recognized as a self-sufficient self-consciousness is not something that is a matter of appearance. If we think of person in the sense that Michael's saying, where it's a how you appear in public to others or something like that.
Well, he doesn't give us very much to go on in this person thing, so
yeah,
I'm not quite sure this is the place. We'll have to remember this passage when I think he brings up the concept of person later on in the Spirit chapter. So maybe we'll just have to hold on to it till then.
He's probably responding to some criticism that was made at the time or something.
He wrote this thing so fast. I don't think he was.
What's at the bottom
he
here?
wrote this so fast. There's no way he was. Anyway, maybe.
What's that, Tyler?
What's at the bottom there? Sich selbst und einander, and then it says person off to the side. I have no idea if that will help us, but I don't know what it means.
No, because one's an 11th footnote and the other's 12th footnote, and they're not related.
Oh, okay.
It's just proving its worth is a little bit of a.
So the German word for person
translation.
Is that what that means?
No, Hegel uses the word person, so it's just the exact same. It's a Latin word.
Oh, it comes from Latin.
Yeah.
Well, but on the previous page, it was individuum, and here it's person. So he's pointing out that Hegel's using a different word in the German.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You know what really came to mind for me when I read that sentence is the slogan "Black Lives Matter." I found out my exact objection to that slogan, which is the lives don't matter, qua being black or being white or whatever. In fact, the lives don't matter because they're people, but because they're individuals. It's their individuality that is at stake. And so really the slogan would be better if it was like our lives matter or something like that. That's my reaction to that slogan. Anyway.
I think we need to wrap up here, guys.
Yeah, I think I'm at the end of my abilities at this point. Did we talk about going bi-weekly yet?
Is there, so it's been brought up about going bi-weekly from here on out. How do people feel about that? And I think it's also we talked about going to 1.5 hours, and so that's what I was officially scheduling. And as a matter of fact, we're running 2 hours each time. How do people, so that, and because we're going 1.5 hours, we also started at 2 p.m. Pacific, not 1 p.m. Pacific. So, but I think let's start with bi-weekly or not.
Yeah, it seems like 2 hours is kind of a natural time. It's 1.5 hours seems like we shutting things down in the middle of a conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I prefer.
And if we're going bi-weekly, then we want more time, so to speak.
Yeah,
I agree.
If we go beyond 2 hours, I start to flatline right now.
Right.
I may already be flatline, but.
right. Me too.
Yep. No,